Chapter 3. So there I was, 1 week the British and European champion, the next, a complete unknown in Calgary. It felt like I was starting all over again. I did like Canada, being up the mountains, the scenery and everything. I'd never seen anything like it. Apart from Bruce, I didn't know anybody, and for a while at first, I felt like a stranger, which I suppose I was. But some things were not so different from home. I was still playing stooge to wrestlers with not much ability, and the crowds were not as big as they could have been. Don't get me wrong, Stampede Wrestling was doing better business than a lot of other territories. But when I arrived, it wasn't great business, and in my opinion, that was down to 2 things, management and money. Stu Hart was the owner, or the promoter, but most of the time it was his sons who seemed to be in control, too many chiefs and not enough Indians. In the ring, they were what I would call glorified. Nice people, very generous and kind, but as wrestlers, completely glorified. And if I'm honest, apart from Brett and Owen, I didn't rate any of them. As amateurs maybe, but not as pro wrestlers. Anyway, there I was, 19 years old, and a stranger in Calgary. I flew in on the Thursday, and was told to be at the Victoria Pavilion the next day for my first match with Stampede Promotions. I walked into the dressing room, and the first person I ran into was the promoter, Stu Hart. He just looked me up and down, started prodding me like a piece of meat, and then said, "Eh, you're a skinny little bastard." Those were the first words Stu Hart ever said to me. But you know, that skinny little bastard ended up making more money for Stu Hart than any other wrestler in Stampede, including Archie the Stomper Gouldy and Abdullah the Butcher. That's true. Stu Hart said it himself. But on that first Friday night, I still had it all to do. It was a television taping which would go out on TV the next day. My first opponent was the Cuban Assassin. He was Cuban, but because he'd wrestled quite a lot in Germany, we were familiar with each other's style. We wrestled hard, had a good match, and I beat him. I don't recall exactly how many people were in the building that night, but it wasn't a lot. It wasn't a lot most weeks. The trouble was, Stu couldn't afford to bring big names into the territory, at least not on a regular basis, because he didn't make enough money to pay their guarantee. So most of the matches were made around the Harts, mainly Bruce, Keith, Smith, and Brett, and while there weren't a lot of other big names around, well, the Harts were the big names, which meant they could be as glorified as they wanted. I did like Calgary, but it took me a while to get used to it. It was a lot colder, and being up in the mountains, the air was thinner, which meant, at first, I was out of breath a lot more than I would have been in England. All the things Bruce Hart had promised when I met him in England, the car, the apartment, the $400 a week. A load of bollocks. There was no car, there was no apartment, and I got paid $350 a week. I found out later that when Ted Betley had been calling Stu to make arrangements for me, he'd really been speaking to one of Stu's sons impersonating their dad. So at first I stayed with Wayne Hart, who didn't wrestle, but was a referee for Stampede. And that worked out okay until he turned round one day and told me I owed him a lot of rent and that it was time I moved out. The original 6 weeks I was supposed to do had stretched to more like 3 or 4 months. And although I was growing to like Canada, I think at that moment, after the lies about the money and the other promises that were broken, I was ready to pack up and go home. I still had my return plane ticket. But the Harts really didn't want me to leave. So we smoothed things over, and I stayed on with Wayne until I could afford a place of my own. Stu and Helen were very good to me and always made me welcome at their house. I'm not sure what the kids thought of me, but I know what I thought of them. Smith was the eldest and a terrible wrestler. Bruce, well, Bruce managed to beat more or less all his opponents without too much trouble, which I suppose made him a great wrestler. We got along well enough at first, and I'll give him credit, he was responsible for bringing me to Calgary. But there was a bit of friction between us which turned into something more serious a few years on. Keith, who was really a fireman, had a similar wrestling ability, and like Bruce, was very good at keeping a clean sheet. Ross was one of the youngest Hart boys. He spent a bit of time in the UK, and I think he worked behind the scenes at Stampede, a nice enough lad, but a bloody awful wrestler. Dean, who died a few years ago, didn't wrestle at all as far as I remember, and he was different to the rest of the Harts. He once asked Jim Neidhart if he could borrow his Cadillac for the day. Jim said okay. But when he came back to get his car, it wasn't there. Dean had sold it. I suppose deep down Dean was okay, he just couldn't help some of the things he did. Brett was really just starting out as a pro wrestler when I first came to Calgary. And although we had our differences in the early days, I did like Brett and probably got along with him better than any of his brothers. Owen, who died in 1999, at this time was just a kid, maybe about 13 years old. When he got a little bit older, he started training and eventually went into the business. Of all the Harts, I think Brett and Owen definitely had the most ability, which was fairly obvious when you see where their careers went. When I first started with Stampede, I was always the good guy in the ring. Being just a young kid and everything, it was the obvious thing to do. That changed a few months later when Dick Steinborn came into the territory and took over the book for Stu. There was one guy I was wrestling at that time, I can't even remember his name, but every night he threw me round that ring like a sack of shit. Up, down, bang, 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 and every time he threw me, the crowd would go, "Oh?" Then after the match one night, Dick came up to me and said, "Tom, you're taking too many good bumps. The crowd is too sympathetic. I'd rather you took the same bumps and had the crowd cheering." So I had a change of heart. I was wrestling a tag match with Bruce, and at one point he got himself into trouble in the middle of the ring. When he finally got close enough to tag me, I bent down to tie my bootlace and pretended I hadn't seen him. I pulled that stunt on him a few times, although at first I did apologize on the microphone for letting him down and said it wouldn't happen again. Anyway, a week later we tagged up for another match. As usual, Bruce was struggling, only this time when he tried to make the tag, I just smacked him in the mouth. Well, that was it, the crowd went wild. After the match, I had to have security escort me back to the dressing room, because the people were so angry. They were screaming and spitting and throwing things at me. I knew at that point there was no going back. To tell you the truth, I preferred being the villain. I enjoyed it. If I could get the crowd riled to near riot level, I'd do it. Because angry or not, those people definitely got their money's worth, and a match they could talk about for a long time. The highlight of the wrestling year in Calgary was Stampede Week, which took place in the middle of July. It was a big occasion, with all kinds of shows and attractions going on all across the city, and a great atmosphere. The best thing about Stampede Week for us was that some of the big American names would come into the territory, a tradition that had gone on for years. Back in 1969, Dory Funk Jr. was the World Heavyweight Champion, and he came to Calgary for Stampede Week, with plans to wrestle Archie the Stomper Gouldie, at that time the Stampede North American Champion and one of the promotion's biggest draws. But the week before the big championship match, they held a winner of this match to face the world champion, as in Dory Funk Jr. Well, that match came down to Archie Gouldie, and a fellow countryman of mine, Billy Robinson, who I mentioned earlier. Billy Robinson was supposedly giving Archie a bit of a hard time. Well, he gave most wrestlers a hard time. In fact, knowing Billy, he was probably giving Archie nothing, if you see what I mean. I don't know what happened, but all of a sudden, in the middle of the match, Archie rolled out of the ring, grabbed his stuff and left. Just like that. Which left Billy Robinson to face Dory Funk Jr. for the World Heavyweight title. That, in my opinion, was where Billy Robinson got one of his biggest breaks, and after that he did okay for himself in America and Japan. In 1978, Stampede Week was still a big occasion for wrestling. Stu always hired the Corral, an ice hockey stadium which held about 5,000 or 6,000 people. He brought in people like Andre the Giant, occasionally, Abdullah the Butcher, as well as the Midgets, and a few women wrestlers. That year we also had the NWA World Heavyweight Champion Harley Race and NWA Junior World Heavyweight Champion Nelson Royal. Now at that time, I didn't know anything about Harley Race, or his track record in the business. The first time I really met him, we were in a car on our way to the next match, for example, in Edmonton. Harley Race was driving, as usual. He always drove, whether he'd had been drinking or not. Nelson Royal was next to him in the front, and I was in the back with Brett. I was saying something to Brett, but because of my accent, which, at that time, was still a strong Wigan accent, Harley Race turned to Nelson Royal and said, "You know, I can't understand a fucking word that limey bastard's saying." So I shouted back, I was only 19. "That's okay, Yank, because I can fucking understand you, which means I must be cleverer than you." Harley slammed the brakes on so hard, we were nearly catapulted into the front seat. The car screeched to a halt and Harley climbed out, looking really angry. He ripped the back door open, leaned his head inside and just said, "Get out." All I could hear was Brett saying, "Tom, don't go out." Well, I didn't know Harley had a rep, but it didn't matter anyway, because in my opinion, win, lose, or draw, you have to make the attempt. So I got out. And eventually, Brett got out. The three of us stood there, by the side of the road, in the middle of nowhere. Then, Harley Race, who had been drinking and driving, grabbed us both in a side headlock and said, "I don't see why we should fight, boys, do you?" He was crushing our heads so tight, we couldn't speak, but as he started to slacken his grip, I stuck a boot out behind him, tripped him up, and put him flat on his backside. Luckily for us, he saw the funny side of it, and the three of us ended up laughing. Years later, Harley Race, the King, and myself became very close friends. We did get into a lot of trouble, in and out of the ring, and he was on the wrong end of some of my worst pranks, but, as Dionne Warwick once sang, "That's what friends are for." Stampede Week was also when I got to meet the great Lou Thesz. He was in Calgary as the special guest referee for the World Championship match. I never actually saw him wrestle, and when I met him in 1978, he must have been in his 60s, but he was still in good shape. I only spoke to him a couple of times that week, but I thought he was a great bloke. I wrestled Nelson Royal for the NWA World Junior Heavyweight title every night. We went round the Stampede Loop, through Edmonton, Regina, Saskatoon, Medicine Hat, and Yellowknife, and finished in Calgary on the Friday. We wrestled for nearly an hour every night, no separate rounds like they had in England, and every night I got disqualified, usually for throwing him over the top rope, which, in Canada meant an automatic disqualification. Then on the last night, Keith Hart wrestled Nelson Royal in the Corral. I watched that match, which ended in a 1-hour draw, and I couldn't believe it. A fireman made a 1-hour draw with the world champion. But apart from that, Stampede Week was a big occasion, and for a fairly unknown wrestler like me, a chance to get yourself noticed. Which was exactly what happened. A German promoter called Schuber came to Calgary that year. He watched my matches with Nelson Royal and afterward asked me if I wanted to go to Germany for the Oktoberfest, a 6-week tournament, later in the year. He spoke to Stu, who eventually said it was okay, and I was surprised to learn that Bruce and Keith would be going as well. I didn't find out why until a few years later. I spent a lot of my spare time over at Stu Hart's house, or I should say, the Hart Mansion, which looked more like the Addams family house. Mostly I'd be training down in the basement gym, which everybody liked to call the dungeon. It wasn't very big, it had a wrestling mat, like the ones you have in amateur wrestling, a few dumbbells and a bench press. In a way it was a bit like Riley's gym in England. Personally, I never saw the point of giving a gym a name, like the Snake Pit, or the Dungeon, but I suppose it came about because of the screams that used to come out of it. If we weren't working the loop, I'd train at Stu's house maybe 5 or 6 days a week. A lot of wrestlers were training down there, not at the same time because it wasn't big enough, but all day there'd be people coming and going, in and out of Stu's house. All the Harts trained there as well as Jim Neidhart, Junkyard Dog, Hercules Ajala, and a few years later, a young Chris Benoit and Brian Pillman. There was a couple of Japanese wrestlers as well, Kazuo Sakurada and Mr. Hito, whose real name was Hadachi. Brett's mum, Helen, was a great lady, always very good to me, very polite, and on many occasions she would ask me over for Sunday dinner. Occasionally Stu would lend me one of his Cadillacs. He owned a fleet of about 20, and I'd drive up to Edmonton to visit my Uncle Eric. Stu was good to me as well. And as I got to know them over those first few months, they got to know me. One day, Bruce and Keith asked me to go skiing with them at a ski resort in Banff, a few miles west of Calgary. Now, as you would imagine, I'd never been skiing before in my life. All I had on were my jeans and a little t-shirt, but they told me, "No, you'll be fine like that, Tom. The sun will be shining at the top of the mountains, you know." So I went. The slope we were going on was about a mile down. They fastened my skis on and we got the chairlift up to the top. I don't think they put the skis on properly because as soon as I set off, one fell off and dragged along behind, because it was still tied to my foot. Well, with only one ski on, I couldn't stay up, and I just fell and rolled, so many times that I lost count. Eventually, about halfway down the slope, I hit a tree or a bush. I'd had enough, so I took the skis off and walked the rest of the way to the bottom. All I had on was this t-shirt, well, more like a vest, and it was about -30 degrees. I finally got to the bottom and went for a coffee to try and warm up. But by this time I was so cold, I couldn't stop shaking. 10 minutes later, those two bastards walked in, smirking and grinning. I never said a word, but I thought to myself, they've done me here. Well, a few months later, I'd been working out with Bruce down in the dungeon, and we both went for a shower. They had this great big shower room with shower heads all round the wall. Bruce was in there, shampooing his head, and I was thinking about that skiing trip. So I turned the cold water off. Bruce hit the roof, screaming and shouting that the hot water was scalding him. I said, innocently, "Sorry, Bruce. I must have hit the wrong tap. I'm sure he still has the marks on his head from the blisters." A couple of weeks after that, I was wrestling Keith in the pavilion. I slammed him as hard as I could, then said, under my breath, "Don't move." I climbed to the top, dropped a knee on his head, and accidentally loosened a couple of his teeth. He came looking for me in the dressing room afterward, a bit upset, saying, "What the hell was that supposed to be, Tom?" "Keith," I said, all innocent. "Just a minute lad, I did tell you not to move. I had it all weighed up, you must have flinched." After that, no matter who he was wrestling, Keith Hart always wore a gum shields. I don't suppose either of them made a connection, but I knew I'd reached a point where other wrestlers would definitely think twice before trying it on with me. One wrestler who I did get along with and who I always rated as a great character in the ring was my old friend Jim Neidhart. Jim was from Anaheim, California, and played football for the Oakland Raiders. He came to Stampede the same year as me, long before he became Brett's partner in the Hart Foundation. His first match was against me, the Dynamite Kid. It was only a little spot show in Lethbridge or Regina, but he managed to fuck it up grand style. In our profession, whether you're in America, England, Japan, Germany, wherever, you always put a headlock on with your left arm. Everything is left, left arms, left legs, you're trained to think left. The only place you don't think left is in Mexico, where you do everything on the right. Anyway, on this night, Jim put me in a right-hand headlock, which meant I had no leverage to push him off onto the ropes. So there I was stuck in a headlock wondering what to do. Eventually I did manage to push him off, but he hit the referee with his shoulder. Jim was about 28 olbs, and the referee went down. Jim managed to hit the referee not once, not twice, but 3 times, and then got himself disqualified. Afterward I said, "Jim lad, you're not ready for this yet." But he got there in the end, and what a great character, I still think the world of him. I was working really hard for Stampede, wrestling the Cuban Assassin and Norman Frederick Charles in. Just after Stampede week, I wrestled him in the main event of a contest for the British Commonwealth title. They'd just introduced that belt, so after beating Norman Frederick Charles, I became the first British Commonwealth champion. I defended the title for the next few months, and eventually it was Charles who took it off me. By this time it was October and I was due to fly out to Germany for the Oktoberfest in Hanover. Keith couldn't go, so the first year I went with Smith, and the year after I took Bruce. I found out a few years later that the Harts had only gone along because Stu insisted they were part of the deal. Apparently he had told Schuber, "If you want Dynamite, you have to take Smith and Bruce as well." In 1981 when I went to Japan to wrestle for Antonio Inoki and NJPW, Stu made sure that Brett was part of that deal as well. Anyway, the Oktoberfest was a good chance to stop off back home in Goulburn for a few days to see my mum and dad. While I was there I had a call from my old friend Marty Jones. He wanted me to wrestle him in Croydon, on a one-night-only basis, for a television match. Well, as I was only passing through I said, "Fine. I'll do it." Also on the card that night were a couple of Japanese wrestlers billed as Sammy Lee and Quick Kick Lee, who were wrestling Mark Rocco and Giant Haystacks. I'd never heard of them, but I found out that Sammy Lee's real name was Satoru Sayama, and his friend was Akira Maeda. What I didn't know then was that Sammy Lee, or Sayama, would be the man behind the mask of the first, and in my opinion the best, Tiger Mask, and the two of us would have some of the greatest matches of our entire lives. But that night in Croydon, there were a couple of nobodies. I was in the dressing room and Max Crabtree was watching Sayama get ready, shaking his head and saying, "What the fucking hell has Karl Gotch sent me?" Sayama was only a small man, but when he got in that ring, well. The crowd, and even Max Crabtree, couldn't believe what they were seeing. Sayama was fantastic. Eventually I made it to Hanover, Germany for the Oktoberfest. Most of the time in Germany I wrestled in tag matches with Bruce or Smith. Now I always thought Smith had some strange ideas, but the year that he came to Germany, right at the end of the tournament, he lost it completely. One of the traditions over there was to have a big parade after the matches, when all the wrestlers' names would be called and one by one they'd go down to the ring to wave to the crowd. The announcer started calling our names, Dynamite Kid, and I walked down to the ring, waving and smiling at the crowd, while they were cheering and clapping. Then it was, Smith Hart. I don't know what Smith was thinking that night, but he came down the aisle with his boots on the wrong feet, which made him look bow-legged. He had a towel stuffed down the front of his trunks, and he'd shaved his long moustache into a little moustache, exactly like Adolf Hitler's. Then he climbed in the ring, stood in the middle, and gave a Nazi salute. The crowd just went silent. There wasn't a sound. And Smith was fired on the spot. The second year when I went with Bruce, there were a few American wrestlers there, Junkyard Dog, the Samoans, Afa, and Sika, and Michael Hayes, who later became one of the Freebirds. There were a couple of English wrestlers there besides me, and some Germans. Most of them were okay, but one German who I didn't like was Axel Dieter. Although Schuber was the promoter, Dieter seemed to be the man in control of the matches. He was always shooting his mouth off about how great he was, and putting the other wrestlers down. I was told that he once pulled a gun on an English wrestler, and said to him, "There is only one shooter here tonight." The wrestler, who in fact was a good shooter, was so scared that he lost control of himself and had to change his trunks. Another year Dieter had tried the same trick with the French-Canadian Bob Delasara, who wrestled as the UFO. But when he pointed the gun, Bob just said, very calmly, "Well, pull the fucking trigger then." Dieter hadn't realized that Afa and Sika, the Samoans, were standing either side of him. So if he had pulled the trigger, he'd have been dead as well. Axel Dieter was a big hero with the home crowd. Everybody else thought he was a no-good, two-faced, big-headed bastard. Well, by this stage of my career, the pranks had become a little bit more serious, and before I left Germany, I decided to cook up something special for Axel Dieter. While I was in Hanover, I stayed at the home of a friend of mine. When he was out at work, I went out to the shops, and bought some ready-made pastry. I rolled it out and put it in a big bowl. I'd also bought a can of dog food which I emptied into the pie. I seasoned it, salt, pepper, some herbs, and a few other, ingredients, and put the crust on top. I got a knife, cut 3 little holes in the lid, so it looked nice, and baked it. It was the last night of the tour, and as usual, there was a parade after the matches. And on the last night, the fans always brought presents for the wrestlers. It might be 100 Deutsche Marks or it might be a cake or a leg of lamb, but they all brought something to place on the timekeeper's table, ready for the big parade. I got to the building early with the pie, which was labeled to Axel Dieter, and put it on the table. At the end of the night, we did our parade around the ring, and the ring announcer gave all the presents out. Axel Dieter had a big smile on his face as he picked up his pie, and for a minute I thought to myself, bloody hell, what have I done? But it was too late, although I did tell some of the wrestlers, whatever you do, don't eat the pie. The next year, the day before the Oktoberfest, my Lufthansa air ticket was cancelled without any explanation. I think someone must have told Axel Dieter about the pie. Anyway, when I got back to Calgary after that first Oktoberfest, the first thing Stu Hart told me was that his son Brett was the new British Commonwealth champion. He said, "I want you to wrestle him for the belt next week." Which was okay by me, but I don't think Brett was too thrilled about it.